Hello, my name is Annette Brown, and I'm Principal Economist here at FHI 360, and I'd like to welcome you to our Research Roundtable. Today, I have with me Dr. Kate McQueen. She works in our Global Health and Population Nutrition division here at FHI 360, but one of the things that I really love is that she's an anthropologist, and so she is really well qualified to do research on the ethics of research, which is what we're going to talk about today. So Kate and her co-authors recently published an article in the Journal of the International AIDS Society titled Using Theory of Change Frameworks to Develop Evaluation Strategies for Research Engagement, the Results of a Pre-Pilot Study. So what Kate and her colleagues are looking at in this article is what is called good participatory practices, and in this case these are good participatory practices, or GPP, for tuberculosis clinical trial research. And so these practices have been developed and they're starting to be implemented, and Kate and her colleagues said, well, we should be able to evaluate whether or not these practices are making a difference. And so they set up a theory of change framework in order to inform evaluation of these practices, and then they actually created some indicators and went out and collected some data on those indicators, and in this paper they report back how all that worked. So there are two things I really like about this. One is that I like any time that people are talking about theory of change, but also, and it does make it confusing to read, but what this is research about how to evaluate, about how to do better research, which may sound a little circular, but is actually really, really important. So with that, I want to turn to Kate and have her tell us more about it. So let's start just by, if you could tell us a little bit more about why good participatory practices, particularly for clinical trial research, are so important.
So the place that I'd like to start for that is with the diseases themselves. So we do a lot of work around diseases like HIV, tuberculosis, TB, Ebola, and other deadly pathogens. There's a lot of urgency in that kind of research.
Right.
We want to get out there, we want to do the research, we want to get the answers, we want to make everybody healthy again. The diseases, these kinds of diseases also travel with a lot of inequality. You can have economic inequalities, political, social, discrimination, stigma, which means we're working with people who are vulnerable. And so when you have urgency combined with vulnerability, you have the risk of moving too fast, not realizing the impact that you're having on people's lives.
Right.
And so the point here is to make sure that we are paying attention as we're dealing with these really important issues, that we're paying attention to the people who are being most impacted. And so participatory processes mean that we are bringing them to the table, and we're making sure that they are having voice, that there is dialogue, and it's active dialogue, so that the people who are going to be living with the implementation and the outcomes of trials are also part of the planning and everything for it.
Right. That's just great. That's really important. So tell us a little bit about this framework that you built in order to evaluate whether or not these practices are making a difference.
So we came at this with the theory of change approach, as you said. And the first thing that we did is we said, okay, well, what's the point? So we brought together a group of tuberculosis, TB stakeholders, globally, different countries, and we said, first thing we need is a consensus on what's the goal of GPP-TB.
Sort of the end of the theory of change.
The end of the theory of change.
Right.
So we came up with a consensus goal, which we said was TB clinical trials would demonstrate social value, achieve increased access across stakeholders, and meet standards of acceptability. I said, okay, that's where we want to get to. The next thing we said is, well, how are we going to get there? So we identified what we called 5 powerful strategies. The strategies are like buckets of practices, but you have to organize those practices somehow. So these come together under strategies. For example, one of the strategies we labeled accountability mechanisms. And these are practices that help people to feel that they understand what's going on with this, that what they're being told is actually what's going to happen. And include practices like having a community advisory board, for example. Having dissemination back to a community about what happened with the trial. Another example that was important to this group was what we labeled as responsible advocacy, which means, especially with TB, how do we make sure that we have the resources we need? How do we know that the information generated from the trial is going to be used appropriately, et cetera?
Right.
So once we had those strategies identified and practices within them, we then said, okay, what are going to be some of the short-term, long-term outcomes that get us to the goal?
Okay, and so that's sort of the theory. So we start with our strategies, and then short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, and then ultimately that ethical goal.
Exactly.
Great. And so, and what I like about that framework is that because you have multiple strategies and then you have points along the theory of change, I sort of envision it as a matrix. And so then, as I said, you thought about what the indicators are that you could measure all the different places on that matrix. So when you went to the field, when you had those indicators and you went to the field, you went to 3 trial sites where tuberculosis trials are being conducted, and you tried to collect the data to measure those indicators. What was the biggest challenge you had?
Well, I think, the biggest challenge is the fact that good participatory practices, GPP, it was new. So when you think about evaluation, you usually think of a program that has structure and it's being implemented in a very particular way.
Right.
This was new. So we were dealing with sites that had heard about GPP-TB but didn't necessarily have any in-depth knowledge about it. So we had to be able to ask the questions in ways that would make sense to people who haven't necessarily been trained in a huge cohesive program of implementation.
Right, so you couldn't sort of point to it and say, how does that work? You had to kind of ask them questions about what they were doing and then map that to whether those fit with the practices.
And that was very important that we be able to come up with ways of asking those questions. We wanted to know, good participatory practices are not a completely novel creation. There's participatory research that's been done.
Right.
And we wanted to know, are people doing things that they wouldn't think of as GPP-TB but maybe should be?
Right.
And so we want to ask questions that get at what they're doing already, as well as being able, kind of generate a baseline of description. And from there say, okay, now if we implement this in this kind of structured way, is it really moving us closer?
Right, but you want to, you don't want to know people know what GPP is and they're doing it, it makes a difference. You want to know whether these kinds of things make a difference to ethical research. So you want to be able to capture it whether or not they know the acronym.
Exactly, that's important.
All right, so you started at the beginning by saying that we need better ethical research for lots of different kinds of diseases. Here, obviously, you are working specifically around tuberculosis. Is the framework that you built here going to be generalizable to these other diseases?
Some of it will be, and some of it won't. So with the statement of the goal, I think some of that will apply generally and broadly, but some of it is rather particular to TB. With regard to strategies, there are accountability, I think, would be a universal.
Right.
But something like responsible advocacy, because that's kind of peculiar to the TB situation, and it reflects the current level of funding. For the work, it may be that if the funding is more adequate, that's not going to be something that people are going to assess in the same way.
Right.
With HIV, advocacy has been a part of why we have research as sustainable as it has been over the last 30 years. And so in the HIV context, I would approach that evaluation differently. And I think in Ebola, which comes and goes and comes and goes, I think I would approach it in an even more different way.
Right.
So,
okay.
So it needs to be adapted to context.
That's great. Well, Kate, I cannot thank you enough for focusing on the ethics of research and helping everyone who works on these clinical trials, and particularly in the contexts where we work on these diseases, to do better research and better evaluation of the research that we're doing. So thank you very much for joining us today for the Research Roundtable, and I hope you can join us another time.